Well, yeah.
Oh.
We're starting with it. We're fundraising. Hello, everybody. I hope we got a sizable contingent to join us here today. This is Steve Brule with Janice Fiamengo, and we are now on Studio B, as you all know, rather than Studio Brule. And you probably remember the history of that unfortunate cancellation. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But in any case, um, we are here today to talk about some of our plans and to start fundraising. So, yeah, my hair, it's there. It's just very short. Michael, this green screen thing is not working out very good. But in any case, try to not to be distracted by the greenness of my green screen coming through on this.
Yeah, you've
It's
got
pretty awful.
a pretty interesting headpiece going on there.
It is pretty awful, but I don't know. I don't know where my earphones are right now, so I'll have to go with the green hair. Oh, green hair. That has so many negative connotations, doesn't it? In any case, folks, we need money for equipment. We want to get Janice a set of audio microphone and recording device that can up the quality of the audio to professional grade, which I think you will notice a difference immediately if we can get that stuff. And that's fairly expensive. I think that one is in the $1,500 range. If we don't get enough for that, we'll look for something at a cheaper price as well. The other thing we need to start getting is a new editing laptop, because the one I have right now is failing in different ways, new ways every day or every month. So the touchpad has raised off the laptop now, and some of the keys don't respond. So I'm using external keyboard and mouse, and I'm afraid this laptop's not going to function for much longer. It's getting long in the tooth, and with the upgrades to the Adobe software, it's starting to really show its age and slowness. So we need to get audio equipment for Janice and an editing laptop for me. So, Janice, do you want to talk about some of our plans going forward?
Mm-hmm. Well, so what we're planning for the rest of this year, 2022, is to complete our history of feminism series. And so that will mean that we're going to pretty much bring the history of feminism up until the present day, or at least to the late 20th century. This isn't all completely planned out yet, but that involves looking at pretty much all the major figures, all the major phenomena associated with the various waves of the feminist movement throughout the 20th century, and maybe into the 21st century. And our endeavor, of course, as everybody who's listening to this probably already knows, is to show that contrary to widespread public opinion amongst nearly everybody, even people who are very critical and skeptical of feminism in its modern forms, is the idea that somehow there was a feminism, or there has always been a strand in feminism that is quite reasonable and necessary. A link to that belief is the notion that women were horrifically oppressed at some point in the relatively recent past, earlier in the 20th century perhaps, or up until 1950, or at least maybe, in the, I don't know, before the First World War or something. And that the feminist movement was responding reasonably and sanely to legitimate grievances that needed to be remedied. And so, and I think that really hobbles our ability as non-feminists, men's issues advocates, anti-feminists, however one identifies. It really hobbles our ability to speak honestly about the problems with feminism today, what it's doing to our society, its hatred of men, its deep bigotry, its utter lack of interest in ordinary women's lives and actually, pursuing female happiness or life satisfaction or maturity or anything useful to society. And so what we've found as we're looking at the major figures in 19th century feminism, and even earlier with Mary Wollstonecraft from the late 18th century last week, is that in every major feminist, every major element of the feminist movement, there is deep irrationality, double standards, unfair characterizations of the society, especially of alleged male privilege within that society. We're looking specifically at Anglophone feminism in the Western world, of course. And I think it's very, very important to get the message out that man blaming, irrational hatred, the desire to destroy the family, the desire to disrupt and make dysfunctional the relationships between men and women in all spheres of activity, that has always been there in feminism. There is no sane feminism that we can somehow retrieve. And so that's the whole point of this series. I think it's a very important piece of historical information, and it helps us to understand why we're in such a bad state today. So we basically got to, I guess, the First World War in our survey. There are many, many more details that we could flesh out, but we're going to leave behind that earlier time. That's kind of the first wave. We're really at the end of the first wave now. We're going to start looking at feminism between the wars, and then, of course, move into the beginnings of the second wave post-Second World War with Simone de Beauvoir, and then all of the major American feminists, starting with Betty Friedan and Kate Millett, and looking at how, of course, feminism colonized the university. Through its colonization of the university, moved out into all the major institutions of our society, to the point where today there is no sphere of society, even sporting events, certainly law, family medicine, social work, education primarily, and journalism. There's simply no sphere of our society that hasn't been utterly taken over by feminist assumptions, with devastating effects for men, and perhaps especially for children. So that's what we hope to show as we go on in with our series. And we'd like to have better production values so that our videos will be shareable and will make an enduring contribution to these important conversations about gender and society. I guess that's basically it.
Well,
And then, of course,
very
ultimately, we want to produce a documentary drawing on some of the information that we found, what we think is most powerful and irrefutable in all of the facts and statistics and texts that we've uncovered.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very comprehensive summary, Janice. In the we've been at this for a lot of years, and we had been talking throughout those years about kind of how to turn this into a cohesive story that's more easily digestible to put out to the public, because I mean, clearly you have I don't know how many hours worth of videos on the truth about feminism. Really, most of the Studio Brûlé was connected to feminists' influence effect on our culture. But after this particular series was conceived as the story of feminism from about 200-300 years ago up to present day, which these series, as you folks probably realize, are kind of following that sequence, and we're coming up into the more modern time soon. And after this, which I think we'll be finished with this series by the end of this year. That's our plan, the YouTube video series. And then we want to get, and we'll have to fundraise, and hopefully, this is our longer term plan on this, is to turn all this research into a feature length documentary, ideally to be shown in theaters. And the reason I think theater is important because a theater showing is not just a work of intellectual presentation. It is also a public event. And as a public event, it's hard to ignore it. And typically, it won't be ignored because of its public nature. And so you see at places like at controversial films, you see movements to protest them, which only serves to highlight the importance of the material. So I think that getting a summarized, you might say unauthorized history of feminism, although we haven't settled on any kind of title here, but this work that Janice is doing an enormous amount of research for this. This work is incontrovertible. It cannot be, the feminists cannot, or detractors cannot find, I think, an intellectual whole soft point of which to destroy the thesis here. And what in our research, I don't want to give everything away here. Give me some feedback when you feel fit on this, Janice, because I think that what we've got pretty much in the bag here is a legitimate, rock solid academic thesis that feminism was never ever about equality, and that feminists their primary assertion is that men have oppressed women throughout history.
Yes.
And that is demonstrably not only false, but virtually the opposite of reality. And we want to nail that point in the public mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, I think that not only what was feminism based on this false claim about oppression, that is something that, I think many people will continue to argue. It doesn't matter, that men were the only sex that was expected to sacrifice life and limb in order to protect one's country, for example. That doesn't ever figure in. That doesn't matter to feminists when one tries to argue about each sex's burdens in a society. They'll keep arguing about that. One can give all sorts of examples of men shouldering the heavier burdens of social and civic life, and it doesn't matter to the feminists. But one thing that they absolutely cannot even begin to argue with is the very deep-seated bigotry and irrational hatred that is overtly there in every major feminist figure, every leader of every phase of the movement, every text written by these figures. The hatred, the belief in ultimate female moral superiority and male just nothingness, really. The idea that men contributed absolutely nothing worthwhile to the society. It's there. You cannot find an early feminist who is actually interested in equality or has any kind of goodwill towards men, which is what has made me think that the situation we find ourselves in now, the attack on male being that we find ourselves, it is not at all recent. It is the product of generation upon generation propagandizing against men and spreading hatred. It only really became widespread after the feminists took over the universities, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. So it was able to become institutionalized. It gained an enormous amount of credibility at that point. But it was there. If you go back to the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls in 1848, a document actually signed by men that says that men have never done anything but demean and debase and oppress women. Like the psychological effect of men agreeing to that kind of a proposition and telling their sons that that is true And and that did become a plank of all progressive movements in the Anglophone world from then on, that men bore this burden of original sexual sin. I think that is just extraordinary and needs to be recognized, that this is not a recent phenomenon. So I think it's pretty hard for feminists to carry on with their claim that feminism is about equality when the evidence of the hatred and the belittling and diminishing and dehumanization of men is there in every single major text they ever wrote.
Mm-hmm. And it's in popular culture in spades. We saw it with the kill all men hashtag, and it's always popping up.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be never present. And I when I reflect back, I grew up in the 70s as a teenager, but as an adult in the 80s, when what you referred to earlier, the feminists were just in the process of dominating the education system. They started in the early 70s, right, around 1970 or so, getting into the universities. But by the 80s, they were just gaining momentum. And I think by the end of the 80s and maybe into the 90s, they had fully taken over the universities. And from there, their influence has spread to every sphere of our society.
Yeah.
The pivotal point, I think, I may be giving away too much of the documentary here, but I'll say it anyways. But I think the pivotal success point that feminists had, and the smartest thing they did, was getting into the university systems as a legitimate academic program. It's not truly a legitimate academic program. It's fluff stuff. It's hatred. It's ideology purely. But they have legitimized their entire hate movement by taking over the education system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And from there, because when you get right down to it, everything that we take, that we have confidence in, and that we give faith to, has its strongest root in the education system. You could say in religion, but religion is kind of similar to the education system. It is an intellectual edifice in our culture. So without that rock in there, I don't think feminist influence would have gotten near as far, having that root in the education system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the enormous power now of that ideology to inform every kind of discussion that takes place in our society is just incalculable. All of it underpinned by this notion that men somehow, white men in particular, of course, somehow deserve to be discriminated against, wrong-footed, placed at a disadvantage, whether it's in a sexual assault trial. I mean, we've seen the effects there just overwhelmingly. The legitimization of the ability of a man to defend himself against an accusation that could land him in prison, and does land many men in prison for a very long time. That would have been impossible without the feminist infiltration of law. Mm-hmm. The horrible injustices that take place in the family courts every day, the denial of men the right to parent their own children, the horrors of paternity fraud, the judicial kidnapping of men's families, the taking away of men's earnings over a lifetime through the lies of an ex-wife. All of that would have been impossible. Well, not entirely impossible, because we do actually see some of it going back to the 19th century. It's partly a result of very deep ingrained gynocentrism, but the excesses of it today are as a result of feminist legal theory, and particularly their assaults on family law, and of course it exists everywhere else too. So yeah, in popular culture, you can't watch anything today on television, any movies, any streaming services. Everything that comes out expresses the feminist narrative, men are stupid, men are vile, they're contemptible, women are strong and wonderful, but also innocent and moral victims with no agency, etc.
Yeah.
The messages are completely irrational, as is feminism at its base. And yet they are all pervasive and accepted by more and more people because of how widespread they are. So I think, yeah, and whether that such a enormous cultural phenomenon can be really defeated is a good question. But I think that by showing that from its origins to the present, feminism has had no interest in equality or in good relations between the sexes. I think that's a really important contribution that we can make.
Yeah. And also revealing in no uncertain terms that their principal claims are utterly false.
Mm-hmm.
They started with utterly false principal claims.
Yeah.
And from there, they use those false claims to justify what they say is a search for equality. And in their search for equality, they do nothing about
Mm-hmm.
searching for equality.
Right.
It's a
Yeah.
fraudulent power trip from day one and right through to present
Mm-hmm.
day.
Yeah.
And so we really need to, we can't defeat this in the sense of that it's not our aim to defeat this. What we can do, though, is make our case to the public for those who will seek out the information, which I think, optimistically speaking, there's maybe 4 or 5% of the population that would even be interested in feminism being revealed for what it is. I'm just a total guess. I'm just pulling that number right out of the air. I'd be happy if there was 5% of the population that was actually interested in what the truth of this movement that is completely dominating our culture in every sphere.
Yeah, I'd probably be happy if it were 1%. Really.
Yeah.
And and it isn't even it's not even difficult to prove. It
No.
is extraordinary. Like, the lies are bald-faced lies, and yet they are accepted. One of the documents that you talked about in your documentary video on the birth of is that the right title? I always get the title
The
wrong.
birth of feminism.
And you go back to 1848. That's the United States, kind of. That's the date, the Seneca Falls.
And that, by the way, as we've discussed before, that is not a hard and fast date, but it helps in a conversation to give the movement a specific date of birth.
Yeah, and it is. I mean,
it's as good as any other.
You can go back further to find origins. Any search for origins continually goes back further and further because, feminism. There's a good claim to be made that feminism really started in the abolition movement, even before 1848, when women started to be discontented about their role in that movement. But in 1848 was one of the first women's conventions, and the statements made in the Declaration of Sentiments.
That's the key right there. The Declaration statement it's I think the first declaration that we are a movement. I take it to be like that. It's like it's like the Declaration of Independence. It's their declaration, which I think they founded it upon that.
Oh, they did. Yeah, they modeled it on the Declaration of Independence, and that was how they imagined it, that this was women's declaration of independence in a sense, or women's declaration that they were angry and were going to start making demands. And yet not every, but nearly every statement, they begin with their thesis, which is that men have oppressed women, in every sphere from day one. And then they have all of these statements underneath that allegedly support that thesis. And it's full of falsities. One of them says that all avenues of education are closed to women. They knew that wasn't true. I mean, some of these women themselves had been educated at institutions of higher education. These had existed in the United States. One of its most deeply held beliefs was that an educated citizenry, including educated women, was absolutely necessary for the functioning of a virtuous republic. And so there were all sorts of schools that were open specifically to give women a very high level education. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the leader of the feminist movement, had herself attended one such school. So she knew it was a lie. They claimed that married women, had absolutely no property rights. And that was also a lie. And she knew it was a lie, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, because she had been involved in legal discussions and legal disputes about married women's status as property owners. And that was being reformed and changed in that very year that she participated in the Seneca Falls Convention. So, like, the level of duplicity, and really one wonders, why did they think it was useful to their cause, and why did they believe they could get away with it, which they did, though?
Which they did.
Yeah. How did they imagine that absolute falsehoods that could be simply proven to be false could support their movement? And we've seen that is the standard of feminist argument: assert falsehoods, keep on asserting them, write a paper in which you put them forward as truth, then somebody else quotes it, then somebody else quotes that. Soon there's a whole body of work alleging something that is demonstrably untrue, and yet stands as a societal truth and is accepted by a large number of people. It's quite an extraordinary cultural hoodwink that we need to keep on trying to expose.
Yeah, absolutely. And it, like you mentioned earlier, I think it was made possible by the culture's very profound and strong gynocentric tendency.
Mm-hmm.
Like, men making such claims would probably be run out of town, at
Mm-hmm.
the front of a gun.
Yeah. Well, and this is why the work of Ernest Belfort Bax is so interesting in relation to this whole phenomenon, both of women's special privileges under the law and of their ability to get away with lies and other crimes, because that's the thing he talks about. And he makes a major case of the fact that women, even caught out in lies or in crime, including violent crime, often have this air of injured innocence, and it allows them, and men buy it. And that was the point he made in his writings in the late 19th and early 20th centuries about what he saw as the massive disparities in treatment in the criminal justice system. Even way back then, even in the late 19th century, women were getting away with murder. They got away with all sorts of crimes that they essentially had immunity for. And he itemizes the various types of crimes that women would not be prosecuted for, including the killing of their own children. And we've got a couple videos now on all the kinds of arguments that were made about women who killed their newborn infants, or even their 3-year-old or 8-year-old children. And all male juries in this patriarchal justice system often simply couldn't bring themselves to admit that the women were guilty, and certainly couldn't bring themselves to convict women. As long as the women had a sad story to tell about the difficulties of their lives, men were willing to exempt them from responsibility. So we certainly see the roots of feminist success in this very powerful tendency on the part of men to forgive women their crimes, and a tendency on the part of women to band together and to declare themselves worthy of special exemptions. It's quite extraordinary, and we see the results of it today, but it stretches way back.
Right to the beginning. You might say to Adam and Eve.
Could well be.
Could
Yes.
well be.
Yeah.
Folks, I just want to remind you that we are doing fundraising, and I did put the links to the fundraising site, which I think might be live now. No, it's still under pending status, but the link to the PayPal is functional. We do believe that this equipment is critical to getting our ultimate stories out there. We will need professional audio, I think, for going to a documentary. At least I feel more comfortable with that. And this laptop that I use for editing its days are numbered, I believe. So that will be a great help for we can get enough money to get this equipment together and continue this series, and hopefully get to the documentary into a theater, which we will have to fundraise on later. There are additional expenses to getting a documentary into a theater that we will have to fundraise on.
And did you mention the fundraising goal, Steve? I don't know if
Yes,
that is
$5,000 US is what we're trying to get here. That should cover the laptop and the audio equipment. Keep in mind, this is a video editing laptop. It's needs to be more powerful than your ordinary laptop. And any help we can get along that goal would be just awesome.
absolutely.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And we have 2 more Flamengo File 2.0s in the can here, ready for the next 2 weeks. I think you're going to enjoy them. You probably see the titles on the YouTube channel. I think the titles are public, right?
Yeah, I think they are. Yeah. Those are, they're fun ones. Well, I think they're all fun and interesting, but next week is a little bit different in its focus, in that rather than looking specifically at a feminist text or a feminist cause, as we've been doing fairly consistently, next week we're talking about the tradition of love poetry in the English language, and what that reveals about the history of male-female relations, stretching back to especially the 16th and 17th centuries during the English Renaissance period. And I'm making the really obvious argument, but I'm not sure that it has been made very often, if at all, really, that if it were true that men oppressed women, that men despised women, that men wanted to control women, you would see some element of that, desire to oppress and control in the poetry that elite men wrote about themselves and their desires and beliefs. And you don't see that at all. In fact, the desire to control women and oppress them is sometimes talked about as a absolutely hideous, sick impulse. And in fact, what we find instead is a body of love poetry that comprises thousands of love poems, in which desire for the woman, frustrated longing, satisfied, happy marital bliss, those are and delirious joy in simply observing the beloved. Those are the central themes of this poetry. Literally thousands of poems written by men about women, celebrating the physical and personality beauties of the woman that the man loves. And I just think this came to me honestly when I was teaching in my latter years, teaching a course on appreciation of poetry. And it just struck me how ridiculous it was that we always talk about the oppression of women, the objectification of women, the turning of women into things that men use for their own pleasure. And you have all of these poems talking about the pain of unrequited love, talking about the exaltation of the beloved, as a kind of sacred being. And it just didn't jive with the standard line about women's poor treatment. So that's an endlessly fascinating subject. It isn't my area of expertise by any means. I'm looking at sonnet cycles and especially the love sonnets of great poets like Shakespeare, Spenser, Sidney, John Donne. But it's just an extraordinary example of the exact opposite of what every feminist tells us. And the feminists do still attack these poems as examples of objectification, but they aren't that at all. They it's something else that's going on when the beloved is praised in the manner that she is. So I hope people will tune in for that one. I'm particularly fond of it. And then the week after that is kind of the end of the first wave analysis that we've been conducting, and that is a analysis of a really interesting, obscure book that I just happened to find through some other reading I was doing, called Towards a Sane Feminism, in which a committed feminist essentially indicts the feminist movement as an insane cultural phenomenon and explains what aspects of feminism need to be disappeared in order for feminism to be sane. She published the book in 1917, and she essentially admitted that all of militant feminism leading up to that point had been useless and wrong-headed. She articulated how she thought feminism needed to be developed in order to be a useful movement, and she predicted that eventually feminism would fade away as it achieved its goals. And its goals, as she said, were for women to have the same rights and freedoms as men and to participate fully in civil society. Well, alas, she was completely wrong in her predictions, but it's very interesting what she has to say about the mania, especially the idea that sex was a form of oppression that men use to demean women. And that too, which of course we know is now a major plank of feminist ideology, but that too, it's so interesting to discover, has its clear roots in the earlier feminist movement that she's talking about, the late 19th and early 20th century feminist movement. So I think those ones are pretty interesting. And then we're moving into the interwar years, the emergence of lesbianism as a political movement, declaring women's emancipation from men, imagining lesbianism as some kind of liberatory sexual practice, preferable and superior to heterosexuality. That too, of course, is a relatively recent phenomenon, but has its roots in the interwar years. And we're going to be looking at the writings of Virginia Woolf, another feminist foremother, dripping with falsehood, anti-male bigotry, and female supremacism again. So yeah, lots of stuff to talk about.
Lots of stuff coming up. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to getting into the to my favorite period from this. Well, two favorite periods, I guess, is the lead up to the 1848. I like the pre-feminist history bit because it shows the hypocrisy of the feminism from its very, very first days, early days. And then the second period that really interests me is their entry into the university system.
Yes.
Because I find that to be a major pivotal point that from which they were able to take over the entire Western world, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've already written a number of those scripts. And again, there's such a falsehood about that. One, it's seen as this great struggle, that it was so difficult for women's studies programs to be installed at university. Totally not true.
Yeah.
It happened in a period of a few years. Every university opened its doors to this false, non-scientific, non-reason-based discipline.
Completely lies. And what's interesting, Janice, I don't know of any other program that completely suspends all academic critique of their thought leaders. There's absolutely no critique. When feminists got onto universities, all of a sudden historians don't know the history of men and women.
Yeah.
You know why they
dared.
don't? Yeah, exactly. Nobody dared because they would protest them and hound them out of the university.
Yeah.
And I saw that with my professor, one of my professors in chemistry at the University of Western Ontario. He was dean of the Department of Chemistry when I went to give a talk or a lecture at the undergraduate class one year. This is in the middle 80s, only a few years after affirmative action started. And he tentatively was feeling me out, and I didn't even know this was going on in the university at the time. But he was telling me that he was frustrated because he was not allowed to hire the most qualified candidates for professorships or for even for the professor, their line of promotion.
Yeah.
His hirings had to be approved by the women's studies department, who had gotten onto the administration and changed the policies, and now that they were required to have all of their hirings authorized by the women's studies department, essentially, who colonized the administrative departments.
Yeah, I
This
mean,
was in like 1986.
Yeah, it has been going on since then. And, again, it's one of these, it's like a open secret, but very few people talk about it. And when they do talk about it, everybody shouts them down or says, oh, that isn't true. It doesn't happen that way. I don't, well, they just deny, but it has been going on since then. There's a wonderful book by Martin Loney called The In Pursuit of Division, race, gender, and equity hiring. And he documents it all and how it began in the late 1970s. And especially then, really came to its flourishing starting in the mid 1980s. And yeah, at universities that I've taught at, anytime a white man was hired, the head of our department, and that was a very rare event because everybody was so gung-ho about fulfilling their various equity commitments, especially the commitment to hire women, but also to hire minority persons. You had to write a letter justifying the hiring of this white man because it was understood, it was overtly stated that couldn't be done if it was at all possible to find another candidate who was not a white man. And yeah, it's extraordinary how the power of the equity agenda that was promoted by feminists in academia, and it's a fascinating subject in itself. The lack of resistance. And I knew lots of people when I was a student, graduate student, and then when I was a young professor, I knew a lot of people who had reservations about what was going on in women's studies programs. They always had an overtly activist agenda. It was never just about studying women, from a variety of angles, which nobody would have a problem with if it was actually a legitimate scholarly endeavor. It was never about that. It was always made clear that it had an activist agenda. It was about changing society, changing social mores, changing women's position, etc. And so many people wanted to speak against it because they could see it was non-scholarly. It wasn't objective. It was ideologically contaminated from the root up. And yet they felt afraid to do so, or they sort of, like, it's so amazing how scholars, even the best, lost confidence in their own endeavor. Like they began to wonder whether the pursuit of objective truth was really something that could be defended anyway. It's amazing how at its core, that fundamental standard of pursuing truth and testing one's findings, whether in the social sciences or in the hard sciences or whatever. It's amazing how that had been weakened to such an extent that it simply dissolved. There was nobody to step forward to defend it by the time feminists made their assault in the 1970s. So there's a whole documentary to be made about that subject as well. And there's been interesting books written about it, especially Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, where he talks about the death of the university by the end of the 1960s. He had already seen it and had seen how quickly people he admired, professors at the universities, abandoned the pursuit of truth because they somehow didn't have the faith in the scholarly enterprise to actually step forward and defend it and to take the flack that they knew would come. It had already collapsed, the whole faith in that enterprise by the late 60s. So wow. Yeah, it's I don't know, it's endlessly fascinating, and I hope people will support us in telling this one piece of it.
To bolster into your point there, in 1984, most people realize that's when the Western world started to legislate affirmative action. And it was around that time and it went immediately through the Parliament in Canada without any kind of hardly any attention or resistance paid to it. But I looked into this some years ago, and I'm going to try and remember the details right now, so I may get a couple of small things wrong, but essentially it was the Trudeau government, big old Trudeau, who gave a ordered or asked for a study to be done and gave a grant to one woman from some women's studies department, with my memory, to study the situation and report back. And she did, and of course, it confirmed everything feminists were saying, because it's who did the study.
Yeah.
And then that was taken and without critique, was a study by one woman changed all of Canadian law and created the affirmative action laws in Canada. And a similar process went in Canada and in the US almost at the exact same time.
Yeah, at the same time. That's the interesting thing, how all of
It's
these
coordinated
things happened.
globally.
Yeah, exactly the same time.
Because all of those women's studies professors, they're all talking to each other all around the world. They're all getting the details of how their legal systems work and who their contacts are in the legal systems. They got all those laws to discriminate against men in particular in place without hardly a breath of resistance.
No.
Interestingly, in 1984. And that from the time, it's almost like the industry leaders knew it was coming through their consultants or whatever, because that was put into Dow Chemical into place in 1984. And we were all of researchers were called to meetings across the Dow Chemical world for the vice president of research to tell us that the new policies will be that they will be hiring and promoting women and minorities over men for the foreseeable future. Of course, nobody believed. Our ears are kind of shocked. Like, I mean, isn't that obviously discriminatory? Isn't there a law against that?
Isn't it illegal?
Isn't there a law against that?
Yeah.
But they did it. And here's the clincher, Janice. The vice president of research for Dow Chemical was a woman in her 50s who climbed to the position of vice president in Dow Chemical Global, starting her career in the late 50s or early 60s. Through all that period of time when she was supposedly oppressed as a woman, and she got to the vice president position.
Yeah.
To come to boards in front of all the researchers and tell us that you men out there who work for me are discriminating against me, and we're not going to promote you anymore.
It's incredible. Yeah.
I mean, you can't if you wrote this into a sci-fi movie, anyone who didn't live in the situation would say, oh, that's too outlandish. That's just too unbelievable. This is a stupid movie. But here it is. And even getting worse with the pandemic and all the rest of the things we've seen going on here, it makes the cheesiest of unbelievable sci-fi movies look realistic.
And in a way, I think it's another thing that's accomplished. Well, I'm kind of repeating myself, but from our history of feminism shows that, like, the psychological softening up of generations of men, I think it had to have already occurred in order for the takeover to have been so easy, so bloodless, so seamless, that there was no resistance. Partly because I think men didn't believe it was actually going to happen. Like, no one could have thought then in the early 1980s that this was going to go on for 40 years and was going to ramp up year after year, decade after decade, with more and more claims by feminists that women were being intolerably oppressed in all of these various spheres of society. I guess partly it was just disbelief, but it was also, I think, that deeply in the heart of so many men has been inscribed this conviction of guilt that goes all the way back to the Declaration of Sentiments, and even sooner, or even earlier rather, that they have done nothing but oppress women from the beginning of time. So that the whole history of feminism, with all of its repeated lies, made possible then the triumph of the second wave with all of its activist successes.
And it
So,
starts even
yeah.
as children. I mean,
Yeah. Mhm.
before I could even speak, I think I've absorbed the message that, well, girls are special. You can't bully
Mhm.
them. You can't hit them. You can't even argue against them.
Yeah.
And whenever, like, I have 5 brothers and 1 sister. My sister had friends coming over and blah, blah, blah. She was a couple of years older than me. But I knew that several things I could know for sure. If my sister complained to my parents, we were in trouble.
Mhm.
Okay. If I complain to my sisters, nothing happens.
Yeah.
Nothing will happen.
Mhm.
And you can't struggle against your sister. So we as boys are raised, by the time we turn sexual maturity, we already know that you can't argue with or confront a woman in any kind of just about anything she ever does.
Yeah.
That enters deep into your psyche.
Mhm.
And then add to that the fact that you're required to seduce them if you want any intimacy. So you're not going to start saying, hey, you're an idiot. What you're
Mhm.
saying is stupid, or even arguing logically against her, because that's going to say, I'm in this mode right now. I need to reproduce. This is your hormones going on. So yeah,
Yeah.
not going to go there at all. Not going to
Mhm.
go there at all. So biology and culture
Yeah.
has
Very
both plays its role.
powerful. Yeah. Mhm.
Janice, I'm from our previous conversation, I'm assuming that you need to get going soon.
Yeah, I've got
Yes.
things I have to do. So, yeah.
There have been a couple of questions about sending physical checks or money orders for contributions. I can't receive those here. Is that something you can receive on your end?
Yes, I believe so. If someone wants to contact me to make that kind of a donation, I'll certainly, you can contact me at my email address,
Which
fiamengo
emails?
it's fiamengo at uottawa.ca. So U as in university, Ottawa, the city of Ottawa.ca. That's my old university email, which is still my primary email. You can contact me there, and I'll
Yeah, I
certainly give
just
you
wrote it
my
into the comments.
I'll certainly give my home address, and I can easily then transfer the money to Steve into our video fund. So yeah, that would be much appreciated. Thank you so much for your
Excellent.
support.
Yep. Thank you, everybody, for your support and for your attention today and being patient with us in this very long hour and a half worth of Studio B with Janice Fiamengo and Steve Brule. So having said that, we should probably sign off. Do have a look in the comments, rather in the description of this live stream video. I'll put in the information about the PayPal link and the Go Get Funding link in there. And for any of you who are more interested in sending either checks or money orders, take a look at Janice Fiamengo's address, note that, and that's the best place to send those things. Janice will manage that part of it. Anything else any ideas or thoughts to leave us with here, Janice?
No, I think that's good.
Excellent. So, folks, hope to see you at the next week's premiere of the next episode of the Fiamengo File 2.0 on Studio B. And signing off for now.
Have a great week.
Ciao.